Hey guys, this is Nadia from Cognito Forms, and together we're going to walk through the process of setting quantity limits on your forms. Essentially, the quantity limits feature allows you to track each unique value entered into a field and then set a limit based on that value. For example, if you have an email field on your form, you can use quantity limits to ensure that the same email isn't entered twice. Or if you have a choice field with a list of products, quantity limits can help you manage your product inventory. This feature comes in handy in a ton of different scenarios, and we do have several pre-built templates in the quantity limits section if you want to check those out. This particular form is the product inventory template, and the first thing we're going to look at is this email field. Over in the field settings, you'll notice the limit quantity option. As I mentioned before, a pretty common scenario you might want to achieve is to prevent the same email address from being submitted on two different entries. You can find a template for this scenario as well, but all you really need to do is hit No Duplicates. Selecting No Duplicates limits the quantity allowed to just one. Now just write a custom error message to display when the limit is exceeded and you're done. I've already submitted an entry to this form, so if we open up the form preview, you'll see that an error appears when I try to enter the same address. Also, since I didn't write a custom message, the default error message just states the field name followed by quantity exceeded. This quantity limit is updated and enforced as soon as you fill in the field, and then again before the form is submitted. Quantity is only counted for a submitted form entry, not an incomplete or deleted entry. Going back to our form, you'll notice another option in the field settings, Specific Quantity. This option lets you specify a quantity limit greater than 1. That value can either be a static integer like 27, or it can be a calculation, which we'll get into a little bit more in a minute. For now, just keep in mind that quantity limits can be applied to several different field types, including single-line text boxes, yes/no fields, date/time fields, email, phone, and website fields, as well as a couple different types of choice and calculation fields. For the most part, this feature looks and functions exactly the same on all these field types, but there are a couple of exceptions, the first being choice fields. For choice fields set to the radio buttons or drop-down types, you can set quantity limits by selecting Limit Quantities from the choice options in the field settings. Then you can specify a quantity for each choice option. Leaving a quantity blank will ensure that quantity limits are not enforced for that choice option. And as before, you can enter a custom error message to display when the limit is exceeded. One thing to note is that changing a choice option label, like Product 1, will reset the quantity available for that choice option. Another exception I should note are yes/no fields. For yes/no fields, quantity limits only apply to yes responses. This is useful for registration forms or other scenarios where people can opt into an event with a limited number of spots. Finally, let's talk about calculation fields. You can apply quantity limits to calculation fields set to the text, yes/no, date, and time types. Calculation fields are really useful for implementing both basic and more complex quantity limit scenarios. For example, if you just want to limit the total number of submitted form entries regardless of field type, all you need to do is add a calculation field to your form, hide the field by setting it to internal view only, and then enter a static value, like a word, as the calculation. Once you set a limit for this field, like 150, the form won't allow the field with the same static value to be submitted more than 150 times, which effectively limits the total number of submissions to 150. That's a fairly simple example, but calculation fields also have special capabilities that make it possible to implement even more complex scenarios. To give you a better idea of what I'm talking about, let's take a look at the time slot limits template. What this template does is restrict the number of people that can sign up for a specific class on a specific date. So here's how it works. I have my calculation field here, which is set to internal view only. You could also set it to never if you'd prefer not to see it at all. For the calculation itself, all I'm doing is referencing the class field value and the date field value. That way, when someone selects their desired class and date, it creates a little string of information behind the scenes. Next, I just set the quantity limit of the calculation field to 20. And now, each class-date combination can only be entered up to 20 times. As I mentioned before, you can use a static value like 20 as the quantity limit, or you can add a bit more complexity using a calculation. For example, you may want to set different limits depending on the class. To do this, try using an if-then statement as your quantity. In this case, we can set the limit for yoga to 15, the limit for Zumba to 17, and the limit for Pilates to 20. You could also use a similar equation to display conditional error messages depending on which class is selected. While we're on the topic of calculations, there are a couple of special calculation properties that you can access with quantity limits. These properties can reference the quantity limit itself, the quantity remaining, and the quantity already used for a specific field. You can check out an example of this on the Limited Use Discount Codes template. This template is just a basic sales form that applies a discount depending on which coupon code a customer types in. Let's take a look at the limit quantity option for the discount code field. Here, I'm using an if-then statement very similar to the one I just showed you with the class time slots, except this one limits the quantity so that each discount code can only be used a certain number of times. For the custom error option, I've set an error to display when the discount code is filled out, but the quantity limit for the discount code isn't filled out, meaning that the discount code wasn't correct and the quantity limit didn't change. Along with quantity limit, you can also reference the quantity used, which is just the number of times the current field value has been selected, or the quantity remaining, which is the difference between the quantity limit and the quantity used. The quantity remaining value will be negative when the limit has been exceeded for a given field. One last thing to note is that these quantity limit calculation properties reflect the values they had when the entry was submitted and will only update when the entry is updated. This allows you to see what the quantity limit was at the time of submissions in situations where the limit is later changed to something else. Alright guys, that's all I have for now, but if you have any questions about setting quantity limits, feel free to check out our help topic at help.cognitoforums.com or get in touch with us by submitting a support request. Bye!